Do we want to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, my video is pinned, correct? Right on. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Untouchable Artifacts Curators Talk. My name is Lehuauakea. I'm Kanaka Maoli Native Hawaiian. I'm an artist and half of the curatorial duo of the past exhibition at Five Oaks Museum called Displace. Some quick housekeeping for Zoom before we get into the program. We will be recording tonight's program, so feel free to turn your cameras on or leave them off, whatever your preference, but please stay muted. Those buttons can be found at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use the chat box for comments and questions throughout the evening. As we begin this event, we encourage you to stay in your body and connect with your breath. Our bodies are part of the land and the ecosystems of the earth. Five Oaks Museum rests within a valley bounded by mountains and shaped by a slow-moving river. The river bends and curves and loops around. The river does not hurry, yet the river persists. Within this valley are also wetlands, oak trees, and all of the bodies and creatures that have always lived here. This is Kalapuyan land. Since time immemorial, Kalapuyan knowledge and lifeways have embodied the truths that this land holds. Native people have always been here, are still here, and will continue to be here. The museum, our collection, and the building that houses them were created by and for settlers and their belongings. For those of us who are guests on this land, we acknowledge that the harms of settler colonialism and extractive modes of taking are legacies which our work must account for and reckon with as we seek to enact justice. The Five Oaks site, from which the museum borrows its name, is a grove of historic oak trees situated near the museum that has been a gathering place for over 500 years. The site holds the complex and intersectional sense of place and community that our work aspires to. We honor all of these things with our presence here at this time and with our shared work at Five Oaks Museum. The Guest Curator program at Five Oaks Museum was created to decentralize the museum's singular authority and voice in storytelling. Instead, the curation and storytelling of all major exhibitions is in the hands of our community members, who can speak about their own history and experiences the most authentically. The museum provides the platform from which truthful, multi-sided stories can be told with support from our staff and cultural resources. If you'd like to support the Guest Curator program, please consider making a donation at the link in the chat. Five Oaks Museum, as an independent nonprofit, relies on the generosity of supporters like you to sustain storytelling and preservation work, extend access to free learning, and ensure that we are accountable to the communities we serve. Monthly donors of just $5 and higher will receive a complimentary essential membership with all the benefits. And a little bit about our curator duo today. Rya Drake-Hueston is Diné, descended from Paiute and Hopi ancestry from Navajo Mountain, Utah. A sculptor, painter, and performer, she uses her background in conservation and historical restoration to inform her art practice. Kat Salas is a multiracial Chicana and Chiricahua Apache femme born in Gallup, New Mexico. They describe their interdisciplinary practice as a desire to see art as a tool for revolution, braiding their work as an organizer and activist with their experience in the world of contemporary art. And with that being said, I'd love to pass it over to our curatorial duo, Rya and Kat. Thank you for being here. So to get into it today, I just want to start off just with asking you to tell us a little bit about your exhibition and where this idea got started.
Absolutely. I wanted to take a second too before we launch too much into it to just acknowledge our positionality as to light-skinned Indigenous people representing an exhibition that we had the privilege to center and are so grateful to have centered so many different voices. Today, we're going to do our best to talk about our specific ideas as curators when it came to bringing these artists together in the platform, both virtual and tangible publication. However, I just want to encourage and say that there's so many things that the only way to really hear the stories, the only people that can truly speak on those things are the artists themselves that contributed to the exhibition. So I really want to encourage everybody here who hasn't checked out the exhibition or who's curious or who has thought about revisiting to take time to do that as well. And to know that if you are curious about knowing anybody else who is in the exhibition, to seek them out, because they are just, just like so much incredible work, so many incredible people, so many talented humans. So and I'll pass it over to Rya.
Thank you, Kat. Yes, when we were thinking about putting together the exhibition, a lot of our desire for the show was to create the feeling of a pre-pandemic intimate space. When the pandemic first started on my part of the Navajo reservation, a lot of the things that my community was used to having completely shut down, and a lot of the gathering spaces were shut down. And the risk when coming together in a way that we were really used to growing up my whole life, that wasn't a possibility. And that translated to the shows that have been hosted during the Five Oaks Museum's now a couple of years in the pandemic. And when we first started getting together to think about a proposal for the show, Kat and I wanted to focus on not only the tradition of storytelling, but kind of bring that into not just a virtual online exhibition with two-dimensional work, but to include a component where the artists are able to speak about their stories and not just submit their work visually for people to read them. And a lot of growth during the trajectory of forming the show and working with the artists and talking with them, and even putting the pieces together into one cohesive show, it changed, it evolved, much like a conversation. And so there was almost like an evolution of exchange of ideas and of language throughout the course of the show that we kind of allowed to move and grow with.
Yeah, I guess you guys have had to be very flexible and adaptive with everything in mind. You kind of touched on it earlier, but could you talk about the importance of hearing these artists tell their own stories with their own voices through the audio recordings that you have available on the online exhibition?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Rya, so much. I agree with everything you said. I appreciate you so much. When we started the endeavor of having a intimate, like creating like an intimate space, creating a show that felt powerful during a pandemic when so many individuals are just being like inundated with time on the computer, we asked ourselves sort of like, how can we personalize this in a way that sets it apart from other exhibitions that are happening online right now. And I think that was sort of like the first step, but I would say that the more conceptual approach that we took is really thinking about what it meant to be doing this with the museum, the historical violence of the museum industrial complex, specifically with Indigenous communities and other communities of color, and also how part of that history and museums as a tool of white supremacy work to both depersonalize and dehumanize the work of people of color, and specifically like Indigenous people as related to the context of this exhibition. Like, I think a lot of Indigenous people, myself included, have gone to like a contemporary museum, and then you go into the Native American art place and you see something that you also like have in your house. And it's just listed as like basket 1978. And so like so rarely do we see spaces like that talk about what goes into like making that art, that is like a single physical person made that. And so in order to kind of combat that, and in order to shift and challenge the way that individuals view art created by Indigenous people, we wanted to have that really, really personal and tangible audio recording to accompany the works. Thinking about the stories that we tell as a community and who tells them, and the importance of knowing and remembering that it was like a living, breathing Indigenous human being. And also, of course, for accessibility, because we wanted to create something that wasn't just, that was accessible for folks that were using screen readers, and also for folks that are visually impaired, but it took it beyond just having like a screen read version of the story, actually being able to listen to that artist and their voice and like the cadence and just something a little bit richer felt important for accessibility.
And that, thank you, Kat. And that kind of feeds into why we chose the title of the show as Untouchable Artifacts, because when we were, again, generating the idea for the show, we are working with a museum. And again, like Kat said, within kind of the history of museums, it's always been kind of dehumanized objects isolated from the maker. You know, the culture might be identified and the date, but the reality is that each of these pieces, each of these artworks within a museum collection had somebody, you know, with a name and with the family and with their own unique tradition and culture and perhaps patterns passed down from their family. And all of that knowledge is, when it's in the hands of a museum that historically doesn't work with Indigenous people, that power is taken away, and it's now yielded by, you know, an institution. And by having the artists tell their own stories in tandem with their, you know, their two-dimensional or representative work, we wanted to have these artworks and this inherent power dynamic. It never leaves the hands of the people speaking the words, and it becomes something untouchable, ungovernable. You can't own it, and you can only exchange this knowledge and these stories. And this is why we also wanted to work on a publication that would be gifted to each of the artists, which will be coming out in a couple of weeks. and mailed out to the participants in the show who contributed and shared their work. Our caveat for that was it wouldn't be for sale. One would be for the artist's personal collection. And then the second one, it's encouraged to be placed somewhere within the artist's community where it would be accessible to other people, as another way to be able to keep the artists kind of at tourism with themselves. They stay in control and their work is theirs and not owned by an institution.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. I know you mentioned there's a forthcoming publication that will be given out to all of the artists and their communities. It seems like that's one of the ways that you envision this exhibition doing work outside of the museum context. Is there anything you'd like to add more about how you envision that playing out going forward?
Yeah, I can add that, something that we worked specifically with artists about was kind of brainstorming around places in their community that would be publicly accessible, whether that's a library and having specific steps available for them to be supported as they go and put the text in a library, but also other places where a publication could be accessible. And there's some pretty cool spots that people have shared. I think like the University of New Mexico was one that I was particularly excited about, probably because I'm from New Mexico, but yeah, thinking about how to encourage artists to continue to share their own stories, and also thinking about disrupting systems by just having more access to Indigenous representation that looks different. And a cool side note of this is that there was actually a high school located in Portland who had reached out to us about using the text in their writing class for the fall semester because they want to focus on kind of Indigenous studies. And one of the teachers there who is Indigenous had become like really frustrated at their like other teacher who was using a lot of, white literature, and just like it didn't really seem representative. And they had found art and attended our exhibition and was like, this would be a great thing to be able to share with students to show multiple like Indigenous identities. And so I think that's also notable in a way that it will hopefully live on and continue to be challenged by another generation and another group of people, because it is imperfect. And also how the more representation happens in different ways in Indigenous communities, and Indigenous people in Portland are empowered and other places are empowered to take ownership of their stories. I hope that this text becomes a living document in the way that folks share the information in it, and also continue to challenge, like, how can we go further? How can we push the envelope further? What are we missing? Because there's always something. And I do acknowledge that. Yeah, I think that's like an exciting thing.
Yeah, when we first started brainstorming the proposal for the show, honestly, it had some pretty like intense DIY punk leanings. We were thinking about making a subversive zine where we'd have like Indigenous kids retell stories in history outside of like a whitewashed lens. And that was exciting. And then what we've kept from that original idea was just kind of really broadening our net for a much more diverse array of ages of the people contributing the work, as well as people from intersecting identities so that kind of undermine the historical image of what role Indigenous storytelling, what does Indigenous storytelling look like historically, how are Indigenous people portrayed, and what happens when you know, the artists are given the chance to do that themselves, that autonomy. Mhm.
Yeah. And I think to name, like to be specific and name, it feels important to me to name exactly like a bit what we're talking about. And I know from my perspective, we live in an age where a lot of us are really familiar with within the Indigenous community, right, of like Indigenous TikTok and like decolonized land and all of these things. But we're also seeing white supremacy continue to intersect with the Indigenous people who are given space, who are named as our storytellers, as our representatives, as our ideals. And those are typically like thin, cis, conventionally attractive, like light-skinned and or white-passing Indigenous people who aren't handing the mic over or creating platforms. And, you know, it was really important to us to have like bodies that looked different, queer bodies, people who identified as being, you know, LGBTQIA2S plus, people of different ages, Black folks that are Indigenous, just the representation of being like, there are Black Indigenous people and they are not any less Indigenous. And those are our storytellers in our community. And it is our job as folks more privileged to continue to like uplift and center those stories and protect those stories. And I think that that was something that we really wanted to do and felt a lot of intention behind. And we're excited because it's also just some great art, you know, like, I mean, truly, so.
Yeah, thank you for that. It really seems like a huge focus was increasing the scope of access to include many different communities that might otherwise not be represented. Do you want to talk about that in relation to how you found these artists and what your process in curating these different stories and artworks was?
Yeah, I can maybe start a little bit and then pass it to Rya, since I think we both come from different curating backgrounds and work really well together. I appreciate Rya's grounding presence of me and like just like so much knowledge and expertise. It's awesome. And you know, I think that the representation of Indigenous people is reflected in a way that like a lot of the time open artist calls, when it's been messaged so heavily in Indigenous communities that there is a specific idea of like what a Native person, Indigenous person that can take up space looks like. I think a lot of folks who don't meet those heavily Eurocentric, influenced and like colonized expectations preclude themselves from submitting because of historical violence and trauma from the Indigenous community to the Indigenous community. And so I think we did do a call out to folks, but we also were really intentional in asking artists, some of which, you know, we'd already known, some of which we didn't know, to participate and being intentional about what would make that sustainable for them and like recognizing why they maybe wouldn't want to and being okay with that also. Also, like I think one of the weirdest things for me about this exhibition is that my dad is in it, which is just like was a trip. And that was someone that I was really excited to ask, thinking about intergenerational artists and growing up with my father being a huge influence to me as a storyteller, as you know, Indigenous man who's very active in his community and the occupation of Alcatraz and was an artist during that time in San Francisco and then later in LA. And like, it was cool to get to ask him. So I think there also was some intersectional community building and challenging, challenging the way that it is sometimes looked down upon to utilize relationships when in Indigenous culture and community relationships are really important. And I feel like trying to reframe that out of the white supremacist lens where it's inherently violent.
yeah, with the artists that I ended up approaching to be a part of to contribute their work to the exhibition, I was really motivated by the chance to actually get to know them a little bit better. A lot of the artists I ended up approaching, I'd admired their work for quite a long time. And my kind of, the things that interest me a lot, apart from just people who just are really hardworking, is their ability to work outside of only one medium. And one of the things that I really was excited to include was Indigenous graphic novelists. And I know that sounds a little kind of strange to focus on, but I wanted to select artists working in mediums where it's incredibly, I don't see a lot of graphic novelists being included in kind of a museum or gallery setting. It happens, but not as much as I want. And I think a lot of that has to do with personal taste. I personally love working in the medium of graphic novels, and I love graphic novelists. And I come from, you know, a community and a family of not just visual artists, but with performers and with people who create comics and zines. And that has, they have just as much a right to be invited into, you know, an Indigenous show, because they are meeting the parameters that Kat and I have set, where we're asking them to tell a story in their own words and to share it with everybody. And I think that they did not just a fantastic job, but an amazing job. And it was beautiful to experience. Yeah. It really was, it was nice to have Kat as a co-curator, because I feel like both of us wanted to see, we both like agreed and supported with each other's visions for what we wanted to bring into the exhibition and why. And the artists that ended up being a part of the show, I think, have all of these aspects that Kat and I both want together, because Kat and I have very different perspectives. We get along, but each of us just has something different to bring to the table. And I think we worked really well together because we kind of were able to respect and also encourage each other to bring those two visions.
Ryan, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Is that okay? Because I'm so curious. Because I feel like I've heard you talk about, you know, your influence of your culture and like being someone who's Diné and where you grew up, and also like the punk rock element. And I'm really curious to hear what like practices of Navajo culture and practices of punk rock intersect for you when you're taking on a project like curating an exhibition.
What a great question. You know, navigating context, I'm from a very kind of remote part of the reservation. It's very south. I mean, it's very north, it's very west, and it's originally both Hopi and Paiute land. And to be, you know, growing up in the 90s when, you know, queerness wasn't, to be quite honest, wasn't as open as it can be now. I think that there's a lot of ties to why I felt so close to, you know, punk and DIY culture when I was younger, is because that energy and that desire to be seen while at once undermining expectations of gender, of sexuality, of just allowing yourself to exist in a space and share space and demand space and scream for space. And you know, you're not asking permission anymore. You are allowing yourself to be present and to be seen and to be heard. And a lot of, I just admire that energy in other people. And it can manifest in a lot of different ways. I mean, you don't have to look like a late 70s punk from London. You can kind of have this energy and look a different way and still be authentically, you know, punk in nature. So it becomes kind of natural to kind of admire like real beauty in that way, something authentic and genuine and raw, and just something that you don't see often because we are society and we're governed by, you know, society's rules, and we're navigating a colonized land where we're taught to conform quite a bit. So whenever I see people fighting that, I love it, and that makes me love their work, and it makes me want to work with them and learn more about them. And that's part of what influences you know, my choices as a curator, and that's what excites me about the art world.
Thanks for sharing, Rya. I think that kind of segues into my next question. And Rya, you kind of answered a little bit just now, but feel free to add on to it. I'm just wondering how you see the project of Untouchable Artifacts within the context of the rest of the work that you both do. I know that you both do art and other work within the community outside of curation. So how do you see this either relating or kind of diverging from that work, or maybe weaving in and out of each other?
I can start and pass it to Rya. Thank you also, Rya, for answering my question. You're so cool. I appreciate you so much. Yeah, you know, for me, I think this was definitely pretty divergent from a lot of the work I've done, because very specifically my experience in curating and organizing has been surrounding like sex workers' rights and sex trafficking and things kind of like in domestic violence, sexual assault. Like that is the work that I do 9 to 5 also, as like someone that works in a nonprofit. And that's also similar to the work like doing like organizing, where I'm like talking and or curating exhibitions around like that specific community. And there are definitely many intersects, but for me, it felt really different. And I learned so much and just like built on skills that I had for sure, but was able to like step outside of that and do something that was more central to like a different part of who I am, which as someone who's a survivor of sex trafficking and who has done sex work and who now manages a program for youth survivors of sex trafficking, that's like a lot of my life. And I think that when you're so deep in that trauma and deep in community that shares that trauma, not that that's everyone's experience, but like I never got to do something that was like just more focused on like a part of my identity and culture that I hold so close to my heart and is so important in instilling like values to me of who I am and how I should live my life. And so that was really, really cool. And I think that I was inspired by people in different ways. And I feel like I'm looking forward to continue to do like the work that I do in mutual aid and at my like day job, and also to move towards more culturally specific work and exploring, as you had mentioned, what those intersections look like. I think the thing that they have in common is like trying to tell stories that are about joy, because we as a community like have our pain and our trauma like is central to like a lot of the stories that are told about us, and sometimes even that we tell about ourselves, which is totally fine in some ways. And I think as a community, two things that are similar is that oftentimes our joy isn't recognized as joy, it's recognized as resilience of trauma and like resilience of colonization. And I believe that in the work that I've done previously, now with Rya, and in the future, we will, and I will continue to push to recognize the joy of marginalized communities as something that can stand alone and be powerful, and is just as valid as the joy of like other people, specifically white people.
Thank you for sharing that, Kat. That's beautiful. My past practice most recently was curating live performances, and it wasn't particularly focused on cultural identity, but it was about identity. It was about queer identity, and it was about holding and protecting space as queer people, and it was about radical expression of gender and about sexuality. And I feel elements of that, like I feel like this show was in the vein of those older performances, those live performances, which kind of took the form of cabaret shows, where we would have a group of about 7 to 10 artists perform throughout an evening on a stage in front of a group of other people in the community. And they would share works that we would then either workshop or laugh with, or, you know, try something kind of messy and experimental. And I really liked the allowing for an openness with the material, but the community of people is kind of the heart and the soul of those performances. And I was making those performances and curating like these spaces when I had access to those spaces. And again, this all ties back into what the pandemic has given us to kind of deal with how do we create that feeling and that intimacy and that sense of space from, you know, my old body of work and pull it into, you know, this show. And I feel like the way that the show ended up happening, it kind of demonstrates this almost like this evolution, this almost maturing of how I used to run these kind of cabaret performances, as well as working in a community that isn't just inclusive of queerness, but has to do with, you know, the community of Indigenous people that, you know, Kat and I and Lehuauakea and everybody kind of works with, sees the work, admires the work, wants to get to know the artist more, all of that. So it's all a part of the body of work. I'd love to kind of leave things open for growth and for transformation, because it's unrealistic to try to, I don't know, hold barriers for myself, because I can only speak for myself. And I like growing, I like changing, I like my practice changing. It feels good, and reinvention is always refreshing.
Thanks so much for sharing that. That's beautiful. My last question is sort of nuanced, so feel free to have a lengthier answer before we get into our Q&A section. But but something that stood out to me a lot while going through this exhibition, and you both had mentioned earlier your desire to highlight voices that are largely intersectional or marginalized within our own communities. And there's such a celebration of all these different stories and different voices. And like Kat said, all these different aspects of our joy, not just our trauma. Could you talk about how these artists in the exhibition feature things in common, or maybe not? Maybe it's something else. How do you see that relating or not relating throughout the exhibition itself?
So I wanted the artists in the exhibition to, every time you turned a page, like in the book, or every time you went to a new artist, say on the virtual exhibition website, I wanted something different. Because a part of this exhibition is I want to experience something new. I want to listen to somebody new. I want to hear their words and see their work and just get a gift of just a glimpse into this life that it's not mine, but it is something that the artist has consented to open up to me. And that's a privilege. That's like a gift that was given, this gift of access to somebody's world and creative practice. And especially being isolated in a fairly small, circle of people, it was almost like a response to social isolation, where I just wanted to be able to just go as far as I could possibly go while sitting and reading, text, and listening to people read the text and see their image and kind of be transported. It's what I love about storytelling. And it's what I love about reading books and going to festivals and to dances, is to just experience the intersectionality of it all.
I completely agree. I think that feeling, of just like experiencing something new, of like wanting to be in something expansive, and that feeling of just like humbleness, and the way that art can humble you is like irreverent, like in my mind, just like going up and seeing in a museum, in like at a powwow, at a car show, like you go and you see these things that are so deeply inherently personal, and also you have a relationship with that person because you are viewing their work through the lens of your whole entire experience. And you have this moment, this like interaction that feels so intimate. When you have this like exchange and conversation or like discourse with this piece and this artist. And I think we wanted to, I know I wanted to, and I think we wanted to bring that to the forefront, that like when you experience this art, like you're in a space with an artist. And I think that when I listened to all of the stories back to back, like I felt like I was in this room, like with this party of people talking and of sharing things. And I was definitely transported into that space. And I hope that other people felt that way, especially in a time where, like 0.8% of Portland, Oregon is Indigenous, and in Washington County, which I believe is where the actual Five Oaks Museum is, it's like 1.3%. So both being, isolated as Indigenous people, and also just like in the time of COVID, like hearing the voice, we probably haven't heard another person's voice sometimes like in a very long time that wasn't on a screen, was powerful for me, and I felt grateful for it.
Wow, thank you so much for just sharing so much about this exhibition and where it's coming from, and also where you both see it going from now. We're gonna start wrapping up our session here today, but we did have one question so far from Sandy Sampson. And they're wondering how you, Kat, and Rya became co-curators.
I'm like, where do I start? Do I start with how we met each other? Or do I start with how like Kat just one day like slides into my DMs when I'm doing nothing in particular and was like, hey, let's curate a show. And I was like, okay, let's do it. Yeah, I met Kat. Kat did Kat agreed to do it too for me maybe 2 years ago. And that was literally the first time that I met Kat in person. Longtime fan of Kat's social media page. A lot of the people that I meet outside of my own circles in Portland, like the age of social media is a blessing because sometimes people enter your life in the most unexpected ways. And Kat was definitely one of them. After I got my first tattoo with Kat, kind of stayed in touch, and then I think we individually thought each other was cool, and then we wanted to like work together. I think Kat is the coolest. I was like, Kat, oh my God, Kat's talking to me. And then we had this opportunity through the Five Oaks, and then we just decided to run with it. I really literally think that like Kat came over one night. It was probably around like midwinter. I want to say it was like February or close to March, which is when I think the deadline for applications was. And we just started hammering out drafts in like this shanty that I built on the back of my house. Like, I just moved my computer in there, and a couple of nights a week, we would kind of keep revising this proposal and brainstorming and workshopping what we wanted from this exhibition. And like I mentioned kind of in the beginning of this, it evolved a lot. There was a lot of changes. We came up with ideas for probably 4 different shows that we could move forward with in very different ways, but we had to respect the museum's parameters and we had to think realistically. Like the shows that Kat and I were thinking of, we could only do if we had like a warehouse and like a band and like an entire like high school full of kids and just give them like $10,000 worth of supplies. So it was kind of like a challenge to get the original concept down to something like manageable and feasible, but the creative process like just was really, really fun, and the ideas were really, really good. And that's my experience of it. Kat, do you want to share?
I love that you think I'm cool because I thought you were so cool. I tattooed Rya, and then like later on her birthday, I like creepily like left like a book of native textiles like on her porch. I was like, happy birthday, like here's this book on your porch. I hope this isn't weird. And I guess we're kind of like internet friends from then. I think one of the coolest things is the first time that we like really hung out was when we were like doing this proposal. And I don't think either of us realized that we hadn't really met in person and like kicked it in person since getting tattooed until we were like writing this stuff together. I also just appreciate, I feel like Rya is like my like other balance, like whatever we want to call it, like balanced, like curator counterpart, because she's so just like incredibly smart, incredibly organized, like incredible vision. And I think that just like when we started talking, it was really clear that we both had like certain skills that complemented each other as well. And I got really excited about it. And then, you know, this thing came to fruition, and we both were like, oh my gosh, like what an opportunity, and excited to curate a show with each other. And also one of the coolest things I think in my personal life that came out of this exhibition is that I ended up going to Rya's home on Navajo Mountain, in the reservation where she grew up, which is like not really that far from the reservation that I grew up on, but we had never like obviously met, like different tribal stuff, just like a whole bunch of like different stuff. Or like they're like, I mean, like to Tucson, like it's where I was like, I guess where I was living that was close to where she was living. So really interesting. And like, I got to be out there and like, we got to have like all of this cultural exchange and just the way that storytelling and like doing work in our community also created this like awesome intercultural or like two cultures that are not the same, but are both indigenous, like meeting and like we were like building fences and like transporting plants. And then I made her go to Flintstone land in Tucson and like all these like weird places that I went growing up in like the middle of the desert that are like free and kind of sketchy. And it was great. I think that, you know, just like so many different levels of what Indigenous community looks like now in every facet of this exhibition.
Yeah, it was really, it was honestly like a great part of the process of curating together was taking some time and going out to the Southwest, which is where we're both from, and kind of seeing how close, you know, we kind of lived or walked around each other. We're like, because a lot of the times we'd be traveling through the Southwest and like we'd both have experiences in the same strange specific place. And we didn't even know. It just makes you think and wonder like how many people you're just one degree of separation away from, where you could take a chance and work on a project and end up getting to know them. And like in Kat's instance, helping build a fence for my mother. Even when I was like screaming and crying and wanting to stop, Kat was like, wow, it must be really hard to stop doing something when you're not even finished. And but it was kind of that energy where like I kind of needed this balance, this kind of like balance of energies and this balance of like motivations that needed to happen. So yeah, really appreciate it.
I appreciate you so much too. Thank you.
Also, and it's worth every cent. So go see it if you're out by what is now known as the Grand Canyon. So.
Right on. I love that. And before we wrap up today, we have one more question from Molly. And they say, y'all spoke so much about joy, which I am grateful for. And I'm curious if there's something in this experience making this show and or in the exhibition content that was a joyful surprise or a moment of learning for you.
The live performance opening of the show was something that I had no idea what it was going to be like. I had no idea how live performances would translate. I had no idea how it would make me feel. And it made me, it was so like at times funny and moving. And the range of performances was exactly what I had talked about earlier in this curator talk, where it was just from a bunch of artists that I liked and respected, and we got to experience the live performances of their work, which is something that I haven't been able to do the entire pandemic. It felt like I was in a cabaret show, but with, you know, all Indigenous storytellers from all different, making in all different mediums. And that was the joy. That was like that was the most at once comforting, because I was so worried about what it would be like. It was the most comforting. It was the most fun. I laughed so much. And it was so engaging. And that, it was kind of like the perfect culmination of what I personally wanted to feel from experiencing these artists sharing the space together. And that was something unexpected. I worry a lot about everything. And I, the moment where I realized I didn't have to worry was amazing.
I Yeah, I completely echo what Rya said. And yeah, sometimes someone just says it all. I have nothing to add.
Right on. Well, thank you both for just sharing your work and your energy, time, and space with us today. I really enjoyed going through this exhibition, and I hope everyone here gets a chance to look through these stories and listen to them as well. Super important work. Again, if you'd like to go visit the exhibition, that direct link is in the chat. Just drop now. Otherwise, we won't take up too much of your evening, and just thank you so much for being here and supporting this amazing work done by Rya and Kat.